Today, we're going to look at the Bramier Rocks Trilayer GMT, a watch with a pretty lengthy name. But you can kind of think of this one as one part Zodiac, one part Longines, and one part Citizen. You see, one of the things that Zodiac became famous for were their mystery dials in the late 70s, which is where they basically swapped the hand for a rotating disc that blended into the dial, which is what this watch is doing right here with that GMT hand. Now, they aren't the first to do this. A few years ago, Alpina did something similar with their Star Timer Heritage GMT, a watch I actually bought and then returned when it started having an issue. Long story with that one. But this watch here takes that idea and then mixes it with a dial layout that's similar to a Longines Hydra Conquest, one that's a diver layout having larger Arabics at the cardinal points. And then take the new Citizen or Miyota's 9075 GMT movement, one that's a Traveler's or true GMT movement. Throw that in the mix, and you have the Trilayer GMT. Now, before we get any further, I do want to point out that this is a prototype that was lent into the channel, and as such, all your standard prototype warnings apply, including there may be changes to the final production unit. In fact, I know there are. And I'll cover all the ones I know about. And I should mention that this is also a Kickstarter watch, and the Kickstarter should be live by the time this airs. That said, let's talk specs. And for this one, they went with a 42mm case with a 49mm lug-to-lug. And for me, I gotta say that 49mm is a little long, but it is livable. The 42mm part is also something to talk about. The trend these days is to go to smaller watches, and most of the new GMTs, or at least the 9075 GMTs, have been closer to 40. So this one is a little larger than those. And I do think with the design, I would have preferred something a little bit smaller. Then again, there's also nothing wrong with 42. I mean, up until a few years ago, that was really the standard for a diver. And recently, I have seen a few comments asking for a bigger 9075 than most of the 40s. So maybe this is an untapped market right now. Meanwhile, total thickness is 13.8. A little bit tall, but most of the 9075s are. However, Bramier did mention that they are going to thin out the case a little bit, so that's one change, and one going in the right direction. Otherwise, most of the other specs and components here, including a 22mm lug width, sapphire crystal and sapphire bezel insert, are fairly standard and what you'd expect from a good micro these days. Now, the case design here is fairly streamlined and straightforward, going for more of a tooly aesthetic with a mostly brushed finish. Except, of course, for these narrow polished chamfers, which again is fairly standard these days, as is the screw-down crown and an exhibition caseback. What isn't standard, however, and in fact is maybe substandard, is the bezel action. This one is pretty sloppy. It's a little loose and actually a little wobbly when you turn it. However, I did mention this to them, and they mentioned that there was something they were aware of, and it should be tightened up and improved for production. So that's two changes. And before we move on to the dial, I gotta say I think there's a missed opportunity here by not using a timing bezel, which is sort of a newer trend on a GMT these days. And many have pointed out that for most people, having a timing bezel is more useful than a GMT bezel, as more people want to time something than keep track of a third time zone. But more importantly, it just makes sense here, as most of the time a GMT hand is the longest hand and it sits right outside that GMT bezel. So when you turn the bezel, it's easy to read what it's referencing. But here, where it's a disc in the middle and there's a lot of distance between it and the bezel, it's a lot harder to read. And this was also a complaint many had against that Alpina. But again here, you already have that 24-hour track next to that GMT disc. And I think since you have that, it just makes sense to go with a timing bezel on the outer edge. It'd be more functional, even if it is less traditional. Now, moving on to the dial, we've already covered some of the basic design setup, but there are a few other things to touch on, such as the reason it's called the Trilayer, and that's simply because it's how it's made. And because of that Trilayer design, there's a lot of really cool depth here. And I especially love the height of the Arabics as they sit right next to a lowered section of the chapter ring. They just seem epically tall. And personally, I really love this type of dial layout on a diver, where it has the emphasis on the Arabics. If you're a longtime viewer and you remember my Orient Mako 2 or even the new Mako 3 videos, you probably already know that. This type of dial design is a rarity in a diver, and it makes the design even more unique with the GMT disc. And I think the brand deserves a lot of credit for throwing this all together and making a GMT that doesn't look like any other GMT out there. Now, there is one kind of odd thing, and that's the brand name on the GMT ring at the bottom. But considering the rest of the dial is made up of a disc that rotates around, it's probably the best place to place it. Putting it anywhere else, and it just kind of clutter up the dial. So there's some good stuff here, but I still have a few quibbles. With this one right here being the biggest one for me, and that's the chapter ring. As there's not a lot of contrast, it's sunken down, and as such, the markings are really hard to make out, at least on this colorway. So at arm's length, it just seems like empty, wasted space. And I'd really love it if they could figure out a way to make those markings stand out more without really killing the design. There's also the date window down there at the 430 position. Now, because of the tri-layer design, it is sunken down a bit. And with that peephole size, it's just really hard to make out. I hate to be the guy that always says this needs to be dateless, but with something like this, that might be the best option. And lastly, we have the hands. Now, I do like the shape, as I think it works with the design. But to me, they seem a tad thin, and they don't always immediately jump out at me. This is something the brand already knows about, and they say a change is coming to reproportion them. And that's 3 changes so far. Now, they did send a render along for me to look at, but honestly, I'm more confused by it. I'm not sure if they're actually wider, which is what I'd want. But they do look shorter, which is not what I want. And I'm not sure they're going to be any easier to make out, so not sure what they're doing here. And as for the Lume, well, Lume is pretty good. The hands could be better, but it does mostly keep up with the Seiko diver. The only problem is that the GMT hand is pretty weak, fades out almost instantly, but supposedly that's another change. Which then leads us to the strap and bracelet. Or maybe not. See, the strap here is basically a proof of concept prototype. They made sure to let me know that the strap that will be on the final version will be better with a better quality leather. Now, as it is fairly comfortable, even with a little bit of overhang. So as long as they don't change it too much, I think it'd be okay. But the watch will also ship with a bracelet, of which I haven't seen. And yeah, they sent some more renders. And at this point, I'm kind of getting tired of looking at renders. But I gotta say, from this, the bracelet doesn't look good. They're going with a really highly polished H-Link style bracelet, which is kind of what Venzionico does. But I'm not really sure that design is going to work with this watch. It's a little more tooly. There's nothing really flashy about it. So I'm not sure how it'll work with a really blingy bracelet with that much polish. Let alone those center links, those just get scratched to hell in no time. Now, if I were to see it in person, I might have a different opinion, but right now, just from those pictures, I'm not sure how well it'll work. And worse yet, see that back there? Butterfly clasp. Butterfly clasp on a dive style GMT. Who thought that was a good idea? But at this point, perhaps you're now seeing a bigger issue, because that's 2 more changes, I think for about a total of 6. Plus, I didn't point this out earlier, but the caseback says Bencler, which is actually the brand's old name. They recently changed it to Bramier, but never wound up changing it on this prototype. And don't ask me why they changed the name, I have no idea. So that's another, and perhaps one too many changes? Now, don't get me wrong here. It's perfectly normal for there to be a handful of changes before production, especially after reviews come in and those who jump on the Kickstarter start voicing their own opinions. But the thing is, there comes a point where this becomes more like speculating on what could be rather than telling you exactly what I'm seeing, which is hard and extremely frustrating to do in a review. Because ultimately, a watch really needs to be experienced in order to be fully understood. And that's the whole point of doing these reviews. So for me, this is a situation, and one I've seen before, where the brand really should have made a more final prototype to send out to reviewers instead of an older one, as there's only so much I can tell you with this one. But if you're considering it, I think you got to go into this one with eyes wide open and know that what us reviewers are saying may not be how the watch finally turns out. I mean, they're going in the right direction, but without actually seeing it, there's only so much we can say. However, if you do jump on it, one major saving grace of all of this is that the early bird pricing is pretty good. They mentioned to me it's going to be 459 euros or about 500 US, which, considering what you're getting, a watch with a 90/75 movement, that's pretty good right now. Bottom line, I like the idea of it, and especially that GMT mystery dial. I mean, that's why I bought that Alpina and why I agreed to do this review in the first place. I think it's a killer idea. As well as the idea of a diver with Arabics, like the Hydra Conquest or Orient's Mako line. In the past, I refer to those as the Hawaiian pizzas of the watch world. As for some, it's a perfect combo, and for others, it's just flat out wrong. But personally, I do like it, and I'd like to see more of these out there. But back to the Rocks Trilayer GMT. Now, I think this is a watch with a really interesting and solid foundation. But from this prototype right here, not the renders they've sent, but this prototype right here, I gotta tell you, it does feel a little bit undercooked and needs maybe some more time in the oven tweaking the design. Now, for the most part, they are heading in the right direction. But with some things, like I'm not really sure what's going on with the hands and that bracelet just seems like a bad idea. So the main thing is that if you're going to go for this one, you're mostly going to go for it because of that mystery GMT dial. And like I said, it's a cool idea and I think a solid foundation for a watch. It's just, I'd personally tweak a few things. Like I'd drop the size a little bit, maybe make that chaptering a little easier to see. Swap in a timing bezel, fully ditch that butterfly clasp, let alone maybe go to an entirely different kind of bracelet. As well as make the hands a tad wider or do something to improve the contrast. But for the love of God, don't make them shorter. And if they were to do all of that, well, I think I'd be in on it. But what about you? As usual, let me know your thoughts on this one down below. If you like it, if you're thinking of jumping on the Kickstarter, or if you can think of another watch that does it better, mention that as well. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, like, comment, or subscribe down below. It really helps the channel out. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and I'll see you next time.